Hello and welcome again to my channel. This is story number 17, which as ever is based on 5 random words, and the words that have been selected for this story are... a bit of a tough one today. It's called Charity. Ex-LAPD detective Leroy Bixler had been in charge of security at the vehicle impound yard for the Hollenbeck district for 7 years. One more year and he'd retire. He'd be 60 then, and his back, feet and eyes would thank him for some time off. Over the 7 years since he'd been gently encouraged to take a desk job, following the crazy lady incident, he had occasionally met an ex-colleague from the robbery homicide division who would chat amiably enough, but always with a slightly condescending air of poor you. He'd only done what many seasoned cops had talked about doing throughout his 28-year tenure on the street. He'd taken himself out of the line of fire to look after his ailing father, his overworked paramedic wife, and 2 young children. Leroy had experienced his share of out-there incidents. He didn't need any more grief now he was approaching the big 6-0. Therefore, he probably shouldn't have locked up the 17-year-old boy in the impounded school bus at the back of the yard. It was for the boy's own good that Leroy had done this. After all, who but a hopeless junkie would attempt to raid an LAPD impound yard? Okay, the kid had waited until the Easter weekend, when security was less tight, and Leroy had let his young deputy Broderick White leave early. Plus he'd managed to get himself a really good pair of metal cutters and a balaclava. But he must surely have known that there'd be someone on patrol and CCTV everywhere. He clearly didn't care. Without the balaclava, he'd had the gaunt and greasy-haired look of the hardened meth head. When Leroy had heard the gates clang shut, he'd been on the other side of the yard patrolling. It had been a little after 3 a.m, and he'd found the boy trying to jimmy open a Maserati belonging to a local drug dealer. Leroy, a former alcoholic whose condition had worsened after the crazy lady incident, could recognise the all-consuming desperation in the boy's eyes, so he'd elected to use the taser rather than the gun to take him down. There were no witnesses to see Leroy fail to announce his presence, or ask the thief to put his hands on his head, or kneel down, or follow any of the other protocols. Leroy had simply crept up to him and deployed the taser. He had plans other than arresting this boy and sending him on his first steps into a spiral of incarceration, unemployment, addiction and petty theft, followed by further arrest, and so forth. The boy might still be green enough to save. Once he had the kid unconscious, Leroy dragged him over to the school bus, which had just one door, prised it open and flung him inside. With some blankets, the fried chicken sandwiches his wife Letitia had prepared for his mid-shift snack, and a thermos of cold water. If he could just keep the boy here for 3 days, he'd probably lose the worst of the chemical dependency, and might be open to some tough love and persuasion. Leroy had made a secret vow 7 years ago not to arrest any addicts, and he meant to stick to it. Right now that might prove challenging. The boy had come to about 20 minutes ago and was trying to break the bus's windscreen with the thermos, which was already badly dented. Leroy had tried to explain that the bus had 2 layers of toughened glass in case of accidents and was pretty impregnable. Leroy had wrapped a thick chain around the door handles, tying them shut. The kid wasn't getting out any time soon. "Let me the fuck out of here!" he shouted, a look of desperation in his eyes. Leroy wondered when he had last scored. If it was more than 2 days previously, that might well give Leroy a head start. "I mean it, man, I'll fucking shank you!" Nothing seemed less likely. Leroy weighed 280 pounds and stood 6'4" on his flat size 14 feet. The kid probably weighed less than a female figure skater. The last time someone had screamed at Leroy like that, it had been a woman so rattled and confused by her addiction that she was practically speaking in tongues. In a fugue of disorientation, she had walked into the middle of the Macy's Thanksgiving parade, swinging an 8-inch knife at the startled musicians and baton throwers who filtered around her. She could have been anywhere between 25 and 50. She had only half her own teeth and was clutching something foul-smelling in a plastic bag and screeching about, "My baby, my precious one!" Whether it was the drugs, her distress, or the chaos all around her, it had been clear to Leroy, the first officer on the scene, that this wouldn't end well. He'd done the right thing, halting the parade and approaching the woman with weapon drawn but pointed at the ground. When he was about 12 feet away, she raised the knife to her shoulder and came at him, screaming. He'd gone for a shoulder shot, but had misjudged and blown half her head off. Children and adults alike were screaming in fear and horror around him. In a daze of bewilderment, Leroy had forgotten all procedures at that point and had approached the woman's body, disentangling the plastic bag from her claw-like fingers, ignoring his stomach's instinctive recoil at the unmistakable smell of rot and looking inside to see what she'd been screaming about. It was the body of a baby, barely less than a month old, but probably dead for at least a week. He couldn't rid his nostrils of the shameful, obscene rot for days. Kid, I'm keeping you here until Monday, Leroy shouted. I know why you're here and what you really want, but it ain't too late to turn it round. The kid tossed Leroy the bird and spat on the glass. Well, charity had to start somewhere. So there you go. I went through a phase in my youth of reading Joseph Wambaugh, I think that's how I pronounce it, novels about the LAPD, and I guess some of that may have stuck. There was always pretty horrific stories as an ex-police officer that he included in his books. Anyway, hope you enjoyed it in some way, and if you did, please subscribe to the channel. I will keep on going with these stories. Please share them, please tell other people, and we'll take it from there. And thanks for listening. Goodbye.